I still remember the exact sentence they used, because it was delivered so calmly it almost worked. "We don't think you're the right fit for where the team is going." No yelling, no accusations. Just a glass-walled meeting room, a printed severance sheet slid across the table, and three people who avoided my eyes like that somehow made it kinder. At the time, I even nodded. I shook hands. I thanked them for the opportunity. What I didn't say was that 2 weeks earlier, those same people had been praising my work in Slack and asking me to stay flexible, while they rushed a project that wasn't ready. What I didn't say was that the only reason I suddenly wasn't the right fit was because I refused to sign off on a shortcut that would have pushed liability onto a client and quietly erased the audit trail. I wasn't fired for incompetence. I was fired for being inconvenient. I'm a mid-level operations lead in tech, not an exec, not a hero. Just the guy who gets looped in when processes touch money, data, or contracts. The kind of role where you don't make decisions, but you're expected to bless them so other people can sleep at night. That last quarter, leadership was under pressure. A big overseas client, a missed internal deadline, and a product demo promised to investors that didn't reflect reality. The solution they landed on was simple. Reclassify part of the workflow, skip one compliance checkpoint temporarily, and backfill documentation later. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. I asked for it in writing. That was the first mistake. Or maybe the only reason I survived what came next. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Suddenly I was slowing things down. Suddenly my questions were theoretical. One director pulled me aside after a meeting and said, half joking, "You worry too much. This is why people get stuck in the middle." A week later, HR booked time on my calendar. When they told me I wasn't the right fit, I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I asked one question: whether my final week would be considered a normal transition period. They said yes. So I did exactly what I was supposed to do. I handed over my projects. I documented my workflows. I summarized decisions that had been made while I was still employed, including who approved what and when. Nothing dramatic, no accusations, just clean, boring records. I emailed those summaries to my manager and copied the shared operations inbox, like I always had. Then I packed my desk and left. For about a month, I did nothing. Slept late, went to the gym, tried not to replay that meeting in my head. But the industry is smaller than people admit, and I knew staying local would mean running into the same leadership circles that had quietly decided I was expendable. So when a recruiter reached out about a 12-month contract overseas, same field, better pay, clean reporting lines, I took it. Different country, different time zone, different life. The first few weeks there felt unreal. I worked normal hours. People wrote things down. When something felt risky, we paused instead of reframing it until it sounded harmless. I realized how tense I'd been for years without noticing. And then one night, while I was heating leftovers in a small apartment that didn't yet feel like home, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my old manager. Just one line. Casual. Friendly. "Hey man, hope you're doing well. Quick question when you have a sec." I stared at it longer than I should have. At the time, I assumed it was nothing. Curiosity. Maybe they wanted the context on a file. Maybe they were just being polite now that I was no longer a problem. I replied an hour later. Neutral. Professional. "Sure. What's up?" The dots appeared almost instantly, then disappeared, then appeared again. I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment the distance I'd put between us started collapsing, and the moment I realized that being let go hadn't ended my involvement in their story at all. The reply came back 5 minutes later. "Do you remember the workflow you built for the client rollout, the reclassification step?" I did remember it. I remembered every version of it because I'd rewritten it 3 times after being told it was too cautious. I also remembered the meeting where they decided to bypass part of it and asked me to align afterward. I answered carefully, not evasive, just factual. Yes, what about it? Another pause, longer this time. We're seeing some discrepancies on their side, just trying to understand the original intent. That was the first tell. Not what changed, not who approved it. Just original intent. Like the problem was philosophical instead of operational. I didn't respond right away. I set my phone down and finished eating. I washed the container. I let the apartment go quiet again. When I finally picked the phone up, there were 2 more messages. Nothing urgent. Whenever you have time. That's when I felt it. That low, familiar pressure. The kind that pretends to be casual but expects compliance. I'd lived inside it for years. I replied with the same tone they'd used on me during my exit. Happy to help. Can you be more specific about what you're seeing? The next morning, I woke up to an email. Not a text. An email sent to my personal address, with my old work email copied in. An address that technically no longer existed. That wasn't an accident. They attached a screenshot. Red highlights. A client message asking why certain controls had been removed without notification. The phrasing was polite, but I could hear the subtext. Clients don't ask questions like that unless someone on their side has already flagged risk. I scrolled, then froze. My name was in the chain, not as the decision maker. As the last operations reviewer. They hadn't forged anything. That would have been sloppy. Worse, they'd used a real approval thread, trimmed context, and let the implication do the work. I felt heat rise in my chest, followed by something colder. Not panic. Recognition. This wasn't about clarification. They were testing whether I'd absorb the blame quietly. I replied once. I recognize the workflow. The version you're referencing was superseded. The final change was approved after my departure. I can forward my handover summary if helpful. It took 6 hours to get a response. Yeah, that might help. Can you jump on a quick call? I didn't say no. I didn't say yes. I asked who would be on it. When they replied, 2 directors and someone from finance, I understood the shape of the problem. That afternoon, the call started. First from my manager, then from a director I'd barely worked with, then from someone I didn't have saved, who introduced himself as helping coordinate internally. Different voices, same message. We just need to understand what happened. We want to get ahead of this. This isn't about blame. Every time I gave the same answer. I'm happy to share documentation by email. One of them finally slipped. Off the record, this would be easier if you could just confirm the process was followed. That was the moment irritation tipped into something sharper. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I said one sentence, slowly enough that there was no room to misunderstand it. I can confirm what I'd documented while I was employed. Silence. Then, okay, let's regroup. For the next week, my overseas job stayed calm while my phone became a museum of missed calls. Time zones worked in my favor. I never responded immediately. I never reacted emotionally. I reread my old emails at night, cross-checking dates, approvals, language. Everything they were scrambling over had been decided after I left. Everything they were afraid of was already written down, and the more they pushed, the clearer something became. They weren't trying to fix the problem. They were trying to decide how much of it they could leave with me before it exploded. By the second week, the pattern was impossible to ignore. They weren't confused. They were coordinating. I could tell by the order of messages, by who reached out first after internal meetings, by the way questions were phrased as if they'd already agreed on the answer and just needed me to say it out loud. Every message circled the same point without touching it directly. Can we reasonably imply this was already in motion when you were still here? I stopped replying for 2 days. Not as a tactic. I needed the quiet to think. I pulled up my old files. Nothing secret, nothing I wasn't entitled to keep. Handover notes, calendar invites, Slack exports I'd saved because they documented decisions, not conversations. I built a timeline the way I would have for any operational review. Dates, approvals, version numbers, names. It was clean. Too clean. The risky change had been proposed while I was employed. I'd flagged it, asked for written confirmation, been told it would be revisited, then I was exited. After that, the change went through anyway, approved by the same people now calling me, just without me in the room. And here was the part they hadn't thought through. When I documented my handover, I'd included a section titled Open Decisions, not to protect myself, just because unfinished work makes bad transitions. In that section, I'd noted the exact workflow, the risks I'd raised, and the fact that final approval was pending as of my last day. That document had been sent to 3 inboxes and archived automatically. I realized then why the calls felt urgent, but disorganized. They weren't trying to rebuild the truth. They were trying to outrun it. The next email came from legal, polite, neutral, carefully worded. They wanted a call to understand historical context. I agreed, on one condition, that the call agenda be sent in advance and that notes be recorded and shared afterward. There was a delay. Then an agenda arrived. Vague, high level, no names attached. During the call, I said very little. I answered questions exactly as asked. When someone tried to summarize my response in a way that softened it, I corrected them calmly. When they asked whether I'd ever informally approved the change, I said no, and referenced the date I'd asked for formal sign-off instead. No emotion, no edge. Halfway through, someone said, "Just to be clear, we're not suggesting wrongdoing." I didn't respond to that. I just waited. After the call, I sent one follow-up email. Attached, my original handover summary. Highlighted, the open decisions section. Single sentence in the body. For accuracy, this reflects the state of approvals, as of my final working day. That was it. That night, something shifted. The calls stopped coming from my old manager, then from the director, then from finance. Instead, I started seeing unfamiliar names, CC'd on threads. Compliance, internal audit, someone with risk in their title. No one asked me to jump on a call anymore. They asked for documents. That's when I understood the full picture. They weren't worried about the client. The client would be managed. Discounts, apologies, future commitments. That was normal. What they were worried about was internal exposure, about why an audit trail disappeared, about why someone who'd raised concerns had been removed weeks before a control failure, about whether that timing looked accidental. And for the first time since I'd been let go, I felt something settle in my chest. Not relief. Clarity. I stopped trying to be helpful. I focused on being precise. Every response went through email. Every statement tied back to something already written. I didn't speculate. I didn't interpret. I didn't defend myself. I just stayed aligned with the record. They thought distance had made me irrelevant. What it had actually done was take me out of their influence. They thought I was gone. I wasn't. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers. First, the emails slowed down. Not fewer, more careful. Longer CC lists. Subject lines that sounded neutral but carried weight if you knew how to read them. Process review. Control alignment. Historical clarification. Then came the message that changed the tone completely. It wasn't from leadership. It wasn't from legal. It was from someone at the company I'd never spoken to before, introducing themselves as part of an internal review function. They didn't ask me to explain anything. They asked me to confirm whether I'd be willing to answer questions if needed. I said yes, under the same condition as before. Written questions. Written responses. From that point on, everything accelerated. Meetings were happening without me. Decisions were being reevaluated without framing them as reversals. The client suddenly stopped asking questions, which told me they'd been given a version of events that bought time, but not trust. A week later, I received a calendar invite by mistake. They forgot to remove me from a distribution list I technically shouldn't have still been on. It wasn't detailed, but it didn't need to be. I saw enough. Compliance, Audit, Senior Leadership. The meeting title included the word post-incident. That was the moment I stopped feeling tension at all, because now the problem had a name. Shortly after that, they reached out again, this time with a different request. They wanted me to consult, not to clarify history, not to explain intent, to help stabilize the situation. They framed it carefully, paid engagement, short term. My expertise would help close gaps and reassure stakeholders. I didn't respond for a full day. Then I sent a single paragraph. I said I was open to consulting through a formal contract, at a defined rate, with a clearly scoped role. I said all work would be limited to forward-looking process improvements. And I said explicitly that I would not retroactively approve, reinterpret, or contextualize past decisions. They accepted within the hour. That told me everything. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with people who had never been part of the original push. Quiet professionals, risk managers, auditors, people whose job wasn't to sell momentum, but to stop damage. No one asked me to lie. No one hinted. No one tried to soften language. I delivered exactly what I said I would. Clean analysis, practical fixes, documentation that made sense. And I watched, from a distance, as the consequences landed where they should have all along. My old manager was on leave. One director stepped down to pursue other opportunities. A reorg quietly erased a role that had once felt untouchable. No announcement, no drama, just gravity. On my final consulting call, someone thanked me for being professional throughout a difficult situation. I closed my laptop and sat in silence for a moment. Not because I was processing anger, because there wasn't any left. A month later, my overseas contract was extended. Longer term, more responsibility. A team that didn't need reminders about documentation or accountability. Sometimes I think back to that meeting room, the severance sheet, the polite smiles, the sentence that almost convinced me I'd failed. I didn't win by exposing anyone. I won by refusing to disappear, refusing to improvise, and refusing to carry weight that wasn't mine. They said I wasn't the right fit. They were right. I fit somewhere better. By the time everything was officially over, no one reached out to tell me. There was no closure email, no apology, no final explanation tying things together in a neat bow. Corporate endings don't work like that. They just stop. I found out in fragments. A LinkedIn update that quietly disappeared. A mutual contact asking if I'd heard what happened. A former colleague who suddenly wanted to catch up, but couldn't quite meet my eyes on the video call. And I realized I didn't need the details anymore. The consulting contract ended exactly as written. Invoice paid on time. No follow-ups. No, just one more quick question. The system had absorbed the shock and moved on, the way large systems always do. What stayed with me wasn't the fallout. It was the quiet. My days went back to being boring in the best possible way. Stand-ups that stayed on topic. Decisions that were either approved properly or paused, without anyone pretending that speed was a virtue. When something felt wrong, people said so, out loud, without looking around first to see who might be offended. One afternoon, a junior analyst on my new team flagged a risk I hadn't seen. He hesitated, clearly bracing for pushback. Instead, I thanked him and asked him to document it. The look on his face stayed with me longer than any of the calls from my old company ever had. Every now and then, I'd think about how close I'd come to doing what they wanted in those early messages. How easy it would have been to help clarify, to soften language, to say something vague that could later be sharpened into a blade. No one would have called it lying. They would have called it being a team player. But that's the thing I finally understood. Teams that need you to blur the record don't protect you. They position you. Distance hadn't saved me. Titles hadn't saved me. Being likable hadn't saved me. What saved me was boring discipline. Writing things down. Asking for clarity when it was inconvenient. leaving a clean trail even when I assumed no one would ever look at it again. Months later, I ran into someone from that old circle at an industry event. We exchanged pleasantries, talked about the weather, the market, the usual safe topics. At one point, he paused and said, "That situation back then, it got complicated." I nodded. I didn't ask how, because I already knew the ending that mattered. I wasn't vindicated in public. I wasn't proven right in a meeting. I just kept my name intact while everything else rearranged itself. They said I wasn't the right fit. And in the end, that was the most accurate thing they ever said.